There are reunions that bring people back together, and there are reunions that quietly tell everyone it's time to say goodbye. This was both. On the evening of May 16, 1983, inside the Pasadena Civic Auditorium, 5 brothers stood together in matching sequined jackets, waiting for their cue. To the cameras, to the audience, and to the millions who would watch this broadcast later on television, it would look like a celebration. A joyful return of the group that had once defined an entire sound, an entire decade, an entire feeling of what American pop music could be. And in many ways, it was a celebration. But for the 5 men standing in that hallway, listening to the orchestra tune up on the other side of the curtain, it was something more complicated than that. It was the sound of an ending dressed up as a beginning. To understand why this reunion carried so much weight, it helps to understand what Motown 25 actually was. The television special had been built around a simple but powerful idea: bring together the artists who had built Motown Records into the most important black-owned music company in American history, and let them perform the songs that had defined a generation. For audiences who had grown up with these records, who had played them on turntables in their living rooms, danced to them at parties, fallen in love to them, Motown 25 was not just a television event, it was a homecoming. And no act represented that homecoming more than the Jackson 5. By 1983, the Jackson 5 were not quite the group that audiences remembered from the early 1970s. The brothers had grown up. Michael, the youngest and the one who had once stood at the front of the group as a child prodigy, had become something the group itself could no longer fully contain. Off the Wall had already shown the world what Michael could do as a solo artist, and everyone in the industry, including the brothers themselves, understood that something even bigger was coming. The album that would become Thriller was already taking shape. Michael Jackson was no longer simply the youngest Jackson brother. He was becoming someone the entire music industry was watching, waiting to see what he would do next. This made the Motown 25 reunion unlike any reunion the group had done before. It was not 5 equal voices coming back together. It was 4 brothers, Jackie, Tito, Marlon, and Randy, standing alongside a 5th who was no longer just their brother, but one of the most significant young artists in the world. And standing slightly apart from all of them, watching from the side of the stage, was the man who had built the foundation that made this entire night possible: Berry Gordy. Berry Gordy had discovered the Jackson 5 as children, signed them to Motown, and shaped them into the group that would become one of the label's biggest successes. He had watched a very young Michael Jackson learn to perform, learn to command a stage, learn to become an entertainer in front of audiences twice his age. For Gordy, this was not just a business relationship. It was something closer to watching a family grow up, a family he had helped raise, even if that family did not always agree with the way he had raised them. By 1983, the relationship between the Jackson family and Motown had become complicated. Years earlier, the brothers, all except Michael's older brother Jermaine, who had stayed loyal to Motown and to Gordy's daughter, whom he had married, had left the label for a new deal elsewhere, a move that had been seen by some as a betrayal and by others as simply the natural growth of artists who wanted more control over their own careers. The split had been difficult. It had created distance, both professional and personal, that had never fully closed, which made it all the more remarkable that on this night, for this reunion, Jermaine was there too. For the first time in years, All 5 original Jackson brothers would share a stage together, not as a reunion tour, not as a permanent reconciliation, but as a single, unrepeatable moment, arranged specifically for this broadcast. Backstage, the mood was not what most people might expect from a celebratory reunion. According to those who were present that night, there was warmth between the brothers. Genuine warmth, the kind that comes from shared history that no amount of distance can completely erase. But there was also something quieter underneath it. A sense, unspoken but present in the room, that this was not the start of something. It was the closing of something. A door being shut gently, with affection, rather than slammed. For Michael, the moment carried its own particular weight. He was about to walk onto a stage with his brothers, the same brothers he had grown up performing alongside, rehearsing alongside, sharing hotel rooms and tour buses and childhoods with, knowing that later in this very broadcast, he would step out alone to perform Billie Jean for the first time, debuting a dance move that would change the way the world saw him forever. The reunion and the solo performance were not separate events on the same night. They were 2 halves of the same story, one looking backward, one looking forward, and Michael was standing at the exact point where they met. Those close to him during this period often described an awareness in Michael that went beyond his years, a sense that he understood, even as it was happening, what moments like this meant. He had spent his entire life being part of a group identity. The Jackson 5 was not just a band he had been in. It was the framework that had shaped his entire understanding of what performing meant, what family meant, what it felt like to stand on a stage and not be alone. And now, for what everyone in that hallway seemed to quietly understand might be the last time, he was about to put that framework back on, one more time, before stepping away from it for good. When the moment came, the curtain rose, and the 5 brothers walked out together. The applause was immediate and overwhelming, the kind of response that comes not just from recognition, but from memory. For an audience filled with people who had grown up with the Jackson 5's music, this was not 5 performers walking onto a stage. This was 5 faces they had watched grow up, returning to the place where it had all started. What followed was a medley of the songs that had made the Jackson 5 famous, the songs that had played on radios across the country, that had been the soundtrack to school dances and family gatherings and quiet nights at home for an entire generation of listeners. The brothers moved together with the kind of synchronized ease that only comes from years of shared muscle memory, bodies that had learned these steps together as children and had never quite forgotten them, even after years apart. But there was something different about this performance, something that those watching closely could feel even if they couldn't quite name it. It was not the polished, practiced energy of a group still actively performing together. It was something gentler, almost careful, as if all 5 men understood without needing to say it to each other that they were not just performing a medley of old songs. They were performing a goodbye. Berry Gordy watched from the side of the stage. He had seen these 5 brothers perform together more times than almost anyone else alive, in small clubs before they were famous, on television specials at the height of their fame, in rehearsal rooms where he had personally worked with them on their harmonies and their stage presence. He knew this group better than almost anyone, and watching them now, older, more guarded, performing together for what felt unmistakably like the final time, he understood something that the audience at home could only sense. This was not a reunion in the way reunions usually happen, a group coming back together to continue. This was 5 brothers closing a chapter together on the same stage where so many of those chapters had begun. When the medley ended, the brothers embraced, a moment that, on camera, looked like simple celebration, the natural response to a successful performance and an enthusiastic crowd. But for those who understood the history standing behind that embrace, the years apart, the complicated departure from Motown, the different paths each brother's life was now taking, it carried more weight than a typical post-performance hug. It was an acknowledgement of where they had been, of what they had built together, and quietly of where each of them was now headed, separately. Michael stepped back from his brothers, and within minutes the broadcast would move toward the moment most people remember from that night, his solo performance, the moonwalk, the standing ovation that would help define the next chapter of his career and of popular music itself. But for a brief moment before any of that happened, there had been this. 5 brothers, one stage, one song after another from a childhood they had all shared, performed one final time together. In the years that followed, the Jackson 5 reunion at Motown 25 would be remembered mostly as a footnote, the warm-up act before the moment that changed everything. Most retrospectives focus on what came after, the solo performance, the cultural impact, the way it announced Michael Jackson as something the world had never quite seen before. But for those who were in that auditorium, and for those watching at home who understood what they were seeing, the reunion meant something on its own. It was the last time the 5 original Jackson brothers would ever stand together on a stage in quite that way. Not as a comeback, not as the start of something new, but as a complete and gentle closing of a story that had begun more than a decade earlier in Gary, Indiana. Berry Gordy, watching from the side of the stage, had built much of his career around bringing people together, assembling groups, pairing songwriters with singers, building a sound out of individual talents working in harmony. On this night, he watched one of his greatest creations come together one final time. Not because he had arranged it that way, but because the 5 men involved had chosen to honor where they came from, even as they were all walking toward different futures. What people remember about that night is the moonwalk. What they often forget is what came just before it. 5 brothers, one last song, and a goodbye that no one announced because it didn't need to be. And perhaps that is what makes it worth remembering now. Not because it was dramatic or shocking or even sad in any obvious way, but because it was quiet. Because it happened the way most important goodbyes actually happen. Not with announcements, but with a song everyone already knew the words to, sung together one more time before everyone moved on to wherever they were going next.